As cliche as it may sound, we've saved the best for the last this evening. It's that time of the year when the capital plays host to economic summits almost every week. But trust me when I say, no conclave has seen a combination like this before. Three powerhouses on one stage, all three have battled and braved odds to emerge winners and come up trumps each time, pun intended here. And who better than them to discuss the future of India in a rapidly changing world? Now, all evening, we've been looking at what else can India do to take that big leap forward. But the Fireside that we have has global and Indian leaders who will give us perspective on what it takes to win in an increasingly protectionist environment that is hostile to globalization and free trade. Should we reassess India's strengths and refocus on our energies? How can we do justice to a demographic dividend in a world that is rapidly embracing automation as well as artificial intelligence? Will reforms be enough to reshape India? To help us answer all this and more, I would like to invite our eminent panelists on stage. Now, the first speaker of the session that everyone has been waiting for, he's a lawyer by training, so winning an argument with him is definitely not going to be easy. But his job description is the government's reformer and troubleshooter, that is, in chief. Tasked with making reforms a reality, the hospitality at his residence, number 2 Krishna Menon Marg, is legendary here in Delhi. And we hope it comes in handy when he tries to bring all chief ministers on board for the GST. He's also someone who's always preferred a check to cash, a habit we are sure came to his rescue in the last week. Please extend a very warm welcome for Union Finance Minister Arun Jaitley. And our special guest for this conclave has come all the way from the US and heads one of the most diverse businesses in the world. A gigantic conglomerate that makes everything from aircraft engines to medical devices to light bulbs. The pace of transformation and disruption that he's brought during his tenure has made people say that he's running a 124-year-old startup. A huge round of applause for the iconic CEO of GE, Mr. Jeff Immelt. And last but not the least, a business leader from India who runs an equally diverse and successful conglomerate that makes everything from trucks to SUVs to software. He's influential not just in the boardroom but also on Twitter, might I add, with 3.8 million followers at last count. Anand Mahindra, chairman of the Mahindra Group. Mr. Mahindra, we hope that you're going to be bringing your trademark wit and humor as you do on Twitter. So with that, Jeff, let me start off with you. Today's agenda is India, the big leap. What is your own sense on where India lies right now and whether we're ready to take that next leap forward?
So first let me say thank you, and it's great to be with all of you here tonight. It's an honor to be with Anand and the Minister. So GE today is about a $130 billion global company. About 70% of our revenues come out of outside the United States. I've had the opportunity over my career to really see India firsthand, see the development and watch the country over a long period of time. So it's always great to be back in the country where I have so many friends, people like Anand and others, so it's great to be here. I think we look at India at a time of real strength. And I would follow up on really the way it was characterized in the previous panel. The first thing I would say is thinking about India for India. How's the market doing? How do I see it evolving? And I see good, steady economic progress. When I look at our businesses here today, both from a revenue standpoint and from an export standpoint, both are growing substantially, more than 20%. We see the markets that we're in having lots of opportunities, but more importantly, we're able to add new capability when it comes to India. 2 years ago, we opened up our first really large-scale manufacturing facility in Pune. Already in 2 years, it has $500 million of contributed value. So in just 2 years, we've been able to establish a world-class manufacturing facility. We see good potential in new areas like rail investment, defense investment. We see expanding our power sector and other sectors across the company. For the first time, we see the capability to really drive great digital context in the country, in the industrial internet, and continue to expand our work there. So as a market, I think India is emerging, never in a straight line, but a stable, dynamic grower on the world stage. That's only half the story. I think the other story is how India fits with the world. And I have the opportunity, because we do business in almost 190 countries around the world, to compare relative economic progress. And I see kind of India on the rise. For the first time, I see the ability to be both a manufacturer and an exporter. I think we live in a digital era. India will be one of the most substantial, if not the most substantial, digital country in the future, both from the standpoint of the consumer internet, but also the industrial internet. So when I look at the big pillars of productivity in the 21st century, India has a chance to lead. I also see an unstable world. Not a terrible place, but a slow growth and volatile world. And on a relative basis, I think India can rise up both geopolitically and economically to have more influence on the rest of the world. In our healthcare business, we now have all of the developing markets are run out of India. So no longer do we just do things in India for India, but we do things in India for the world. So as an outsider, I would say that the perspectives are quite positive, both in terms of economic growth in the country, but more importantly, how India fits with the world. But we have the opportunity tonight to really interview each other, and we have a chance to have our own kind of fireside chat up here. And I'd have to say, maybe 2 weeks ago, I'm sitting in the United States, and I read a little story. It was on maybe the third page of the business section of the Wall Street Journal on demonetization in India. Very small, kind of hidden story. And I thought it was interesting. And then I land in India 2 days ago, and I find out how seismic and how far-reaching this policy really is. And I thought I'd turn to the minister and just ask you to give us an update on demonetization and how important it is and the impact it's going to have on the country, which I think most people outside India have no idea the context and the importance of such a bold and dramatic move.
Well, before I just answer that specific question, I'll just add to what you said in your opening comment. You see, India's relevance and India's roadmap can be judged from 2-3 other basic parameters. The first being that when the world does well, almost everybody in the world does well. But I think the real challenge comes for any country to defy the global trend when the world is finding it difficult to move. India is one of the few nations which has defied that trend. Secondly, I think it's important, India's displayed its capacity to take decisions. I was listening to the discussion on the previous panel, and when this last 2.5 years was being discussed, where the world moved more towards protectionism, including the developed world, India, as a developing economy, which normally would have a greater trend to lean for protectionism, I think has increasingly moved away from it. You don't have single protectionist voice now being raised as far as the country is concerned. It's become increasingly more aspirational, possible for us to take difficult decisions, a very large constituency of people supporting difficult decisions. So if you just look at the last 7-8 months, I used to hear a phrase, where are the big bang ideas? So you had the Aadhaar platform, one of the largest platforms in the world, being actually legislated and implemented. You had the insolvency, bankruptcy provisions by a unanimous vote. You have a GST by a unanimous vote. And now you had this particular decision. And I think we've moved away from a problem which developing countries normally have, that decisions are questioned as being colorable, corruption. I think all that's been left behind, and now you have an agenda where serious economic issues occupy the space. Now, coming to this, the currency issue, so far, formally, the high denominational currency has ceased to be a legal tender. Some more legal steps will be required later on if one is to extinguish that. I think it's important to realize as to what was the Indian normal for the last 70 years. It had almost become the Indian normal to have a parallel economy. You have a shadow economy. It was almost a way of life. And therefore, when you had a very large chunk of currency, the country dealing with each other outside the banking system, you had a narrow taxation base because the shadow economy itself would bypass the taxes itself. You had banks which were becoming somewhat in a challenge, if not a vulnerable position. I think that's the normal in which we were functioning. This one decision now redefines the Indian normal. There's a new Indian normal. Now, if 15 years ago, the same parliament where some of my friends from some of the parties said, are we close to a digitized economy, or are we close to being a credit card economy or a plastic economy? The leftists who normally oppose any reform are making fun of the idea itself. Now, 15 years ago, if somebody had suggested that every poor man in India will have a mobile phone, people would have laughed at him. I think it's the same psyche. Once you start moving in, you'll move to a situation where the farmer will receive his money from the trader by the electronic mode. He can buy seeds and fertilizers by that. He can pay his children's fees by that. Today you have people in the plantation sector or in some industry say, well, I always pay my workmen in cash. But why should your workmen not have a bank account itself? And you should automatically transfer it to them. Well, just as the telecom revolution, which was never envisaged in India, and it took place, I have not the least doubt that 5 years or 8 years down the road, probably the new Indian normal is going to be different. We are going to live in an entirely different kind of an economy. Now, if you would ask me, let's say a month ago, as to what were the areas we were doing well, we had a lot of public spending going on. We were firing on that engine. We had a lot of foreign direct investment. We had some urban demand. We had some rural demand, likely because of a good monsoon. And then you said, what are the big challenges? Well, the bank's ability to support growth itself was limited because of the NPAs. Their lending ability was a little suspect. The private sector wasn't bringing in the kind of investment which was required. And of course, the global situation is somewhat slow. Now, let's see the impact of this judgment, of this decision in the medium term and the long term. it suddenly has pushed up the ability of the banks to lend and lend at a cheaper rate. So the ability of the Indian banking system to support growth, to support the economy, which itself had become extremely doubtful, suddenly the banks are now flushed with funds coming into the banking system. There may be an element of compulsion in it. And these are all low-cost funds. So these low-cost funds are going to be lent to Indian businesses, to Indian trade, to Indian agriculture, for Indian infrastructure, at a much lower rate today. And of course, the private sector, which was feeling stressed, this directly impacts on this. So overnight you have two important, powerful engines being added to whatever the existing engines were. And then, of course, in the long run that I mentioned, it's going to change the way that traders will trade. It's going to change the way that we'll manage our household budgets. It's going to change how farmers will manage their systems. It'll bring more transactions into the banking system. You'll have a cleaner economy, a bigger taxation system. And I think this one decision, as I said in short, redefines the Indian new normal.
Anand, what do you think?
Yeah, let me not try to give any incremental value. It's hard to do that because he's defined it with a phrase I think that's going to stick now in people's minds, the new normal. But since you asked the question, let me just add a perspective that might give you some context within our corporate context. You know, when I thought about this, and I've been looking or hearing the public discourse on this for the last few days, one of the things was, why did you do this? Couldn't you have done this as well? And isn't this risky? And I'm thinking to myself, well, in the business that you and I are in, as leaders, we are in fact expected sometimes to take very bold decisions. And we laud them. I dare say you and I would have lost our jobs a long time ago if we hadn't taken some really bold calls where we didn't know what the answer was. We idolize Elon Musk and Richard Branson for stepping into the unknown. Elon's doing his space exploration. Some of his crafts haven't taken off. Branson's exploded. We never questioned that. But the discourse following this, I think, wasn't appreciative enough of the boldness of the decision. And then there's been an incredible amount of questioning on execution, rightly. But then on this went wrong, that went wrong. I think you and I know, and our friend Bill Solomon at HBS, who talks about entrepreneurship, tells you that in today's world, you don't plan business according to a budget and then go out and make it happen to the budget, according to budget. The way you work today is you have a plan, you have an aspiration, which has to be bold enough and correct enough, and nobody's arguing about the correctness here, but then you do what they call learning loops. This is an expression, sir, that Bill Solomon has invented. He says that entrepreneurs have to go out there and be so sensitive to the mistakes or the feedback coming in, and your success depends on how quickly you learn and close the loop. So a series of small concentric learning loops is what makes you succeed. Now, I would have faulted this if there wasn't a war room in place, which there seems to be in government, every day learning what's going wrong and trying to fix it, acknowledging that this may not work. And rather than, I think, indicting them for this, I think this needs to be lauded. So that's one context. The other thing people have been talking about is that, yes, it's bold because the Prime Minister risks alienating his constituency. I think the traditional constituency has been one of the traders, the businessmen, the small businessmen, and is he really alienating it? And arguably they've been praising him for that. I have a very intriguing possibility that I'm thinking of, and maybe this will take it back to you then. President-elect Trump has apparently succeeded because he tapped into a vein of angst in the public, the working class public, that was really angry with the establishment, that felt they were too cozy, there were vested interests, and he tapped into that vein. I'm beginning to wonder, sir, that the Prime Minister may actually have tapped into a vein in this country that was angry with this establishment, that felt there was too cozy a circle of vested interests, of corrupt interests that were thriving on black money. And I dare say that's why we're not hearing about very significant unrest. An American private equity banker who came in and saw me day before and was asking me about this, and he said, you know, it's interesting, I don't see any unrest on the streets. If this was Paris, people would have been on the streets by now. If it was really something that was causing an incredibly hard and critical amount of inconvenience, people would have been on the streets. Now, I know I'm not in a win-win situation here, because the moment you say this, I will get loads of tweets back that, have you ever stood in a queue in your life? Do you know what the inconvenience is? I'm willing to withstand that. But the fact is, this has been a very bold move, which we should respect. And secondly, it's going to be interesting. Time will tell. I think he's tapped into a public sense and a public sentiment there that may, in fact, work in his favor.
I think I'll just supplement what you said for two good reasons. You see, at the end of the day, Indian traders, shopkeepers, retailers will also realize that formal official trade is certainly a superior way of doing business than just the shadow economy. It has its own pitfalls. And therefore, by this shock therapy, bringing everybody into a cleaner system of economy is in the long run going to be welcomed by all. Secondly, I can't recollect another decision taken in recent Indian history in the last several decades, I think, which was ethically and morally so correct. Every honest man felt, I have no reason to be worried. Because, and when he found somebody, either because of crime money or because of excessive black money, lack of tax compliances, and so on, I think that's the reason why there was a popular support behind this. Now, just one issue I'd like to join issue with some comments which I have been publicly hearing on the execution part. I don't think this could have been better executed than what it's being executed now. Let's first try and understand how a decision of this kind is taken. You are replacing 86% of India's currency. And you have to replace this without any social unrest, without any significant economic disruption, in a matter of a couple of weeks. Now, while you do this, when you take this decision, a substantial part of this currency has to be printed in advance. A currency printing is an exercise which can take years in some cases because of the security features and the speciality which is involved. It's not a month or a 2-month exercise. So you have to take a decision, you have to actually have the printing ready. You have to have 4,000 currency chests, the currency to reach there. You then have to make bundles so that it reaches 1,25,000 banks, 200,000 ATM machines, 86,000 banking correspondents, 1,30,000 post offices. So about 5 to 6 lakh distribution points. You have to keep this a secret. And then suddenly the RBI board recommends, the cabinet accepts, and within 24 hours the implementation begins. So without an implementation, you implement it. Now obviously when a currency replacement takes place, there is bound to be initial inconvenience, but you don't have a single major incident in the whole country. It's moving smoothly. As every day passes by, today I went and saw the banks myself, the queues have become extremely small. And this is all over the country. And the next 1 or 2 weeks, we particularly will have to make sure that more and more currency reaches the rural areas, because that's where it's required. Now, this is probably in recent memory the largest currency replacement that has taken place anywhere in the world. There hasn't been a bigger one. And to achieve this without even a small incident, in a matter of couple of weeks, eventually when the history of this period will be written, it will be commented on. Oh, why should people stand in a queue and so on? Well, you have to decide whether a few days inconvenience in this whole process, and then you bring about a significant change in the way people live, in the way people spend, and in the way the country then manages its own economic affairs. Just on this issue of tax compliance, I'm not getting into crime, bribery, terrorism, just tax compliance. Let everybody in this audience make a mental note. I don't want an answer. The government of India gets about 8.5 lakh crores on direct taxes. Let's say this year. We get about 8 lakh crores on indirect taxes. And I put a question to this audience. If everybody honestly paid his taxes, what should this figure have been? Would we at all have deficit budgets? Would we at all have inadequate money to invest into the rural areas? The answer is very obvious. And therefore, if the GST comes which is a more efficient tax system, where evasion becomes more difficult, if you have a much wider taxation base on direct taxes, our ability to reduce the level of taxes itself in terms of percentage itself will increase, and then you can widen the base. And then it's much better to have a much bigger GDP and a cleaner GDP as far as India is concerned. That's the whole object of this exercise. Now to say, well, there is a queue, an old lady was standing in a queue, and therefore we should never go in for a reform of this kind, I think eventually we'll have to take a long-term vision of the comparative advantages.
You know, Minister, what I learned, maybe a tip, when really you're in the middle of a big change process like this, don't read the newspaper or watch TV. That's what I've always tried to do. Just stay in the moment, and I always figured that when you are the news, you don't have to read the news.
But we do want people to watch this program.
Of course. But, you know, change is, and not all three of us know, change is hard. It's very difficult to get it right the first time, but what's really important is a sense of purpose. But what I piggyback on something Anand mentioned earlier, it was mentioned in the previous panel. You know, we are a global company in a time of protectionism. And the most difficult thing to do as a leader, I find, is when to understand that the world you grew up in has gone by the wayside, and the world you're facing is something completely new. Now, the elections in the United States, maybe that was only the 5th incident in the last few years to really point to more nationalism, more protectionism. You had the Brexit vote, you had various moves in China. I could go down a list of various things. And even though, you know, philosophically, you know, I'm a globalist and a free trader and believe in trade deals, and I advocate for them, over the last 4 or 5 years, we've really tried to reconstruct GE to be able to still grow and thrive without trade deals at moments in time when there is more protectionism. And the way we've driven that is by having a much more decentralized business model, by having much more local capability, by having 400 factories around the world that can make and sell a variety of different products. You know, so as a result, we've kind of made ourselves able to make things in the United States and sell in the United States, but still be able to push forward globally to access important markets around the world. So I guess the point I would make tonight is that globalization isn't going to end because people want to access growth in new markets, but the nature of it will likely have to change for business people in terms of how we navigate the world. Anand, how do you see it in your context?
there is great concern, Jeff, around the world about what your new president will do. As we've talked earlier, you said he's a deal maker. And so deal makers sometimes can very easily change their stance without any fear. And as you said earlier once, somebody could just say, I changed my mind. So I have no fear of that if he's going to be practical and if he's going to recognize that in the long term, America doesn't want to be locked out of what is going to be the largest emerging market in the world. Nirmala Sitharaman is a great deal maker. I'd love to see her go head on with President Trump. I don't think she'll come out doing badly, so I don't worry about a deal maker head of your government. If he's practical, he's going to see the value of not getting India to lock itself up. The countries that worry about protectionism and isolationism are countries that are small GDPs and which are export dependent. I know we were trying to become much more export driven. Mercifully, we haven't become as export driven as we want to be. Anytime we want, we can close the borders and, raise the drawbridge around the moat here and thrive on our own. We did that for years. So I don't think we have much to worry about as long as the leaders of this new, somewhat rightist world recognize the practical dangers of trying to shut us out. Secondly, India is in a very interesting sweet spot. I remember when Penny Pritzker came here last, she was telling me that, look, you've got to worry as India has to worry because you're not part of TPP, you're not part of APEC, you're not part of ASEAN, you're not making any choices quickly. You've got to get into a grouping. We were literally going to be the ones at a dance being the wallflowers. We didn't have a dance card. All of a sudden, there's no dance. We don't have to worry about not having a dance card. And frankly, bilateralism, if that comes back into vogue, India is not at a disadvantage. In fact, I would maybe at this point like to turn it over to you, Minister, and say, one of the things I think India can do to make a great leap forward, frankly, rather than lament the return of bilateralism, is to perhaps use the fact that America's president-elect is very positively inclined towards our Prime Minister, very positively inclined towards India. A few days before election, he was lighting a Diwali lamp. So I think he's very positively inclined. What do you think we could do to capitalize and leverage on his positivity here to maybe create a new kind of bilateral relationship which will help us, help me, and help Jess?
Well, I think irrespective of what the result would have been, bilateralism, as far as India and the United States is concerned, was bound to improve by the day. That's been happening. That's an exercise which would have gone on. Just a comment or so on what you earlier said. My own impression of the US politics has been that the Republican Party conventionally has been for greater free trade. It's only in the last one and a half years that the narrative completely changed. And that's maybe because of the sense they got out of the local feeling of a section of the American population. Now, world over, when elections are held, there's a far greater rhetoric you have for protectionism and other ideas of this kind. When finally governments take over, the tone is significantly different from what happens during the election campaign. In this case, it may take a much longer time because the election campaign got far more polarized. But at the end of the day, I think at some stage or the other, when the economic cycle in the world moves on, growth picks up, it returns back to the world, that even the undercurrent of the discussion in the United States itself will change. Already, I have had a discussion with a large number of British ministers who were all exiters. And they all start a conversation by saying, well, we've exited, but please don't consider this protectionism. Despite the exit, it's going to be far more trade deals, and the first one we'd like is to have it with India itself. And therefore, we are open to international trade. We are going to be far more open. So don't confuse exit with protectionism. So already the exiters in the UK politics have been saying so. So I think at the end of the day, the correct word which Anand you used was the world won't grow in isolation. No country will grow in isolation. And therefore, at the end of the day, the countries will have to consider. GE couldn't prosper if it just confined itself to 2 or 3 countries in isolation. And the last point I wish to make is, the world comprises of consumers. The consumers want goods and services of the best quality at the best price. And if domestic producers can't give it to them, if domestic service providers can't give it to them, they'll probably look elsewhere. And therefore, that will defy the geographical boundaries.
I would say, just to agree, you know, some of this is just arithmetic. If you're an American company or the U.S., you have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's GDP. That's not going to sustain itself through isolation. So the choices are not for a company like ours to pull back. We have to continue to push forward. In our case, look, we're an American company. We're a proudly American company, but we can't continue to grow without access to the world. I think it's up to people like business leaders like me to work with the new president to embrace the way he wants to run the country and to be supportive of it. But at the same time, I would look at all of my great Indian team that's here tonight, and they should know that we will not pull back from India. We will keep going forward. We will keep investing on a global basis, and we will be true to ourselves and our strategy and our team on a global basis. And I think it's up to us to navigate both camps. Now, the other point I'd make as a person or as a company, in one generation, I've seen GE go from 80% inside the United States to 70% outside the United States. It's made us more competitive. It's made us hungrier. It's made us a better company. One of the things that distinguishes the Indian entrepreneurs versus their counterparts around the world is they've globalized. It's made them become better and more proficient. So I just think this will take a different shape. There'll be more protectionism, but I think that doesn't mean that there'll be a disconnection on a global basis. But let me shift again and on to productivity and manufacturing, make it in India. How real is it? And what's your sense for where the country can go? And I'd ask the minister the same question.
You know, we face a kind of conundrum right now because if we had started Make in India in '85 when China began opening up, it was a different world. The next years after '85 were one of thriving global growth, an insatiable appetite for goods from China. We're beginning this campaign at a time when, even though we're all optimistic on this stage, there are calls for closing down borders and so on. So the question is, what kind of making will we do in India? The other conundrum which we face in Make in India is not only are borders coming down, but the nature of manufacturing is changing. And maybe at some point later I'd love to hear about your view on this, but I call it proximate manufacturing. 3D printing is the equivalent of the early feudal days when everybody had a little furnace in their backyard and they made their own tools, did their own manufacturing. It's bizarre. We are going back to the days of the guild. People will be able to make things in their own garages. Now, in that kind of environment, how do we compete with the many proliferating garage manufacturing of 3D printing in the US and everywhere around the world? So those are the two conundrums. Now, my answers to them, Jeff, and I'm going to quote something I've heard from the Niti Aayog, which is the erstwhile planning commission here. They've come out with a plan, and the finance minister can comment on this. Dr. Pangaria said that he would like 2 SEZs to come up in India, coastal SEZs, one in the west, one in the east coast. Gujarat and Andhra Pradesh are being talked about. And he said to me, he said, Anand, I know you've done private sector SEZs, but this is a different scale. We're talking Shenzhen, Guangdong type scale. And what he wants to do then is to attract in here very quickly manufacturers who have done this, who've been there and done that. And I agreed with him. I told him, you know, to be very honest, I don't know whether I'm ready to invest and take that leap into giant scale manufacturing, then go out and convince Apple to buy from me. But if you get Foxconn in here, they come with the client, they come with knowledge of large-scale manufacturing, and they're going to come because they're worried about Chinese costs. They need to hedge that. They're also worried about the Chinese political situation. So you will be able to attract them. So I think if we really go after this very quickly, and I think, Mr. Minister, we have to do this because the next big concern we have post-demonetization is creating jobs. That's what we have to do. So that, I'll stop there because I'd like to hear your view on these SEZs and whether we're going to go after them with a vengeance.
I think we have no alternative but to expand on manufacturing. It's not that we have another option. We've missed many of the manufacturing revolutions, from the industrial revolution to the low-cost manufacturing. We've missed them in the past. And I think the situation is somewhat changing, and maybe to our advantage. The presentation which Mr. Mahindra just now spoke about is based on one basic premise, that the Asian economies, which started late over the last 5 to 7 decades, each one that has done well, worked on a principle. You had Japan, you had South Korea, you had Taiwan in the first round. They used technology, and they connected their domestic industry to a global market. When China emerged, it was large-scale manufacturing, but again linked it to the global market. And that's why scale is going to matter. And therefore, as a part of the scale, whether it's along the manufacturing zones, the corridors which Nirmala Sitharaman was just now referring to, or it's the SEZs, the big ones on the coastal zones, what Niti Aayog is referring to, you have a huge domestic market, you have a lot of domestic talent, you have a human resource, your wages fortunately have become more competitive than China, your taxation structures are becoming now friendlier, and their potential to be friendlier in future is also going to be there. And therefore, you have a situation cut out for that particular direction. And I think in terms of job creation, you'll have to have a blend of large structured manufacturing along with strengthening India's informal sector. You can't choose between the two, because with a population of this size, you'll have to create jobs everywhere where you can. You'll have to create them in the... and there are areas of manufacturing which are much easier for us. Food processing. In a country where you have such a large number of people involved in agriculture, you have a huge surplus agriculture, and we haven't still got an advanced food processing industry. So these are all areas which can come easily, and these are low-hanging fruits. And I think time has come with the rates probably going to come down in future, wages far more competitive than the rest of the world, a trained human resource. And the foremost I said was, at a time where the world isn't doing well, people are looking at us, A, because your growth rate figures are much higher, B, you are displaying a tendency to open up the economy and invite people, both in terms of technology and capital, and your ability to take quick decisions and even difficult decisions. And I think that's where India is going to score over a number of countries.
Just to add to this quick thing, then I wanted to ask you your reaction to this. The Finance Minister began answering the second conundrum that I was talking about, approximate manufacturing. What he advocated is what I call a bifocal approach. We have to do the SEZs, but we have to make sure that in rural areas we create smart villages, And as we speak, we have a very interesting experiment I'll keep you posted on. We've just taken a village outside Pune, and we put a 3D printer into a school. And we said, let's see what these kids come out with. Whether they can take rural artisanship, rural skills, and use 3D printing to build a new kind of product and a product ecosystem. I'd love your thoughts on all of this, and where does IoT fit in, and what is how is GE going to help this Make in India revolution?
So I would say, Anand, in many ways, India missed the first wave of, let's say, industrialization in Asia that China grabbed. Now, what India caught was this unbelievable growth in business process outsourcing. Amazing what's taken place in the country, places like Bangalore. But what China got in the early days was the way to use a market to bring development and then drive export. The entrepreneurs, people like Anand did it, but that was, let's say, wave one. So when somebody like GE comes to India today, and we look at the opportunity to bid on the locomotive program, we don't think about, look, so we want to tender for 1,000 locomotives. Believe me, we don't think about it that way at GE. We think that this is going to allow us to build a foundational base in India, to localize a locomotive, to build it for decades, to export from this country to the rest of the world, and we think 4 or 5 steps ahead. So I think as the government gets smarter about defense, how to localize defense, how do you localize the oil and gas industry in India, how do you localize infrastructure in India, people like us, we pick it and then we drive it. We drive it into the ground. Now, the way to think about it, and I will know this, for every job at GE, there should be 8 in the supply chain. 8 in the supply chain. So that's how you pick up the SME development. That's the value of a manufacturing job. So I think the strength of the way I see the government in India today versus all the previous governments I've seen is they connect the dots to say, if I do this here to build infrastructure, there are 4 or 5 more things that can happen that are valuable to the economy. That makes a global investor know more about what to do. Now, the second point. In the United States election this year, every election speech started with, our goal is to create more manufacturing jobs. Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump, Jeb Bush, everybody started the same way. Except nobody really knew what they were talking about, really, In other words, there's certain things you need to do to create manufacturing jobs. You need infrastructure. You need the right tax policy. You need training. You need material science. You need regulatory reform. You need 5 or 6 things that are going to help drive manufacturing jobs. So the task for the minister is to give the vision, or the prime minister, but then do the 6 or 7 things around infrastructure, taxes, training, that actually create the manufacturing jobs. That's key. The last thing, the amount of innovation that's going on in manufacturing today is unbelievable. The ability to print high-tech parts made out of titanium and do it in one flow with no waste. The intersection between the physical world and the analytical world, that's what's next. So if I left you just one investment idea, just like the social media, just like the enterprise internet, just like the consumer internet, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, Alibaba, Baidu, go down the list, the next 5 or 10 years are going to be about the industrial internet, are going to be about the intersection of the physical and the analytical. And there, I would argue, India is one of the 2 or 3 countries in the world that are in the best position to see that through. A, because you understand digital, and B, because you have great industrial base. And finally, this country is all about productivity. You can't survive here unless you have productivity. So the task for the country is to grab this next wave, this next intersection of physics and analytics. And we're just completing $1.5 billion of acquisitions of 2 companies that do 3D printing, right? They have maybe 100 or 200 million dollars in revenue, and this is, I think, what's next.
I'll check whether the one we're using outside Pune is yours or not.
I'm going to sell you one tonight, okay?
But I wanted to ask the finance minister. Jeff is stressing on jobs, and I think, sir, the demonetization move, when it is completed, and I don't say if, when it's done and dusted, I think the biggest priority now is to get jobs. Because even for your government, re-election is going to depend on that more than anything else. What can we look forward to from the government to answer the kinds of questions Jeff and I are raising, the possibilities we are raising, and what are you going to do and with what speed on that front, sir?
See, let us look at all the tests that Jeff just now applied. Policy. We have an open investment policy. We have made it very easy to bring investment into India. In terms of infrastructure, this is for the first time we find that different areas of infrastructure we are thinking big and we are executing big. Piyush was just now mentioning how we got the highway sector back. What is our great vision now, rather than merely the size of the Indian railways, to improve the quality of the infrastructure as far as the railways is concerned? You're thinking in terms of airports, not merely the 70 existing connectivities. We want to add 35 more into the regional sector so that we can, at subsidized cost, so that you will probably have flights landing up at even Tier C cities and Tier D cities in India. You have rural roads. You have, fortunately, the kind of resource, this currency step that we have taken which is going to provide us to the banking system, its ability now to support infrastructure, its ability to support certain agricultural programs, certain housing schemes, now depending on whatever the priorities of the government are going to be, is suddenly going to increase. And therefore, we should anticipate in future programs which will give a fillip to the economy, which of course is going to generate a lot of jobs. Now, manufacturing is obviously one area, and I think the ability of the banking system to support the second limb of the bifocal priority, which is the informal sector. Now, the schemes like Mudra, which support the informal sector, because that's a sector which has created far more jobs than even the formal sector has. And therefore, we can't afford to ignore that in India. That's going to be the entire approach. So from infrastructure to manufacturing to the informal sector to newer areas of economic activity. And our ability now to support that economic activity, suddenly as a result of last week's decision, has improved.
Minister, let me, we've talked about the importance of people, populism, the people on the street. Give me your perspective on what should companies like the two of ours be doing better? What are we missing, do you think, in the context of the world we live in today, from the eyes of a public servant?
Well, I think companies like yours, which I have observed from a distance, or for that matter, Mr. Mahindra's company, I think you are all innovating, you are adding to manufacturing, you are yours, of course, is in a very large international group present across the world. This is, the Mahindra itself is a domestic group, which is now producing not only for India, but also outside. And it's done well in the kind of quality of products that it's produced. But I think the potential for making India a greater manufacturing hub, I can quite see over the next decade or so that roadmap being laid out. And therefore, as a part of your expansion plans, India's going to be much better, much easier for doing business. And I think the one important factor that is changing in India is the popular support for growth, development, policy evolution. Many parts of the world are seeing problems where they are going in for unconventional solutions, negative interest rates and so on. I think in India we haven't reached a state of this kind. We can afford to take the decisions. Now, I used to be told 2 months ago that GST would become one of the greatest legacies of this government. We made even the GST look smaller. Well, that's the kind of reforms India is now in a position to undertake.
Anand, what would be one thing the government could do to help make business more competitive in India?
You know, it's interesting, you talk about this ease of doing business report that comes out. Ironically, Kaushik put me on this advisory body for this ease of doing business report at the World Bank. Unfortunately, the year I got on, we got demoted. I didn't know whether it had anything to do with me. Probably didn't. Mercifully, we got promoted. This year, we've had a very measly increase. I think it has a lot to do with timing. Interestingly, sir, the two elements for ease of doing business which brought us down, one was payment of taxes. So I suspect next year there might be some dramatic improvement in that. The second one was access to credit. But when you look at what they mean by access to credit, it's not about whether banks are lending. It's about how many businesses or how many people are registered in the credit bureaus and credit registry. It's about transparency of information. Once again, what's happened here, I think, will change that. So I believe I'm not privy to any inside information. I'm just on an advisory body. But I suspect we're going to rise dramatically next year. So what we need the government to do is more of the same. I think, if you heard the minister just now, he knows what the answers are, Jeff. He doesn't need the answers. The question is, how hard and how fast are we going to make the changes and the aspirations they already know?
I think, taking a cue from this, many changes which are happening, which the investors also feel, are not factored in adequately, but that apart. I think we must learn a lesson from this. There are areas where we need to improve. For instance, the time gap between deciding to set up an industry in India and the actual manufacturing taking place. Now, the policy allows you an easy entry. You can probably get credit. It takes no time now to get either an FIPB clearance or an environmental clearance. Now, when all this is extremely easy, we need greater tax clarity, and we are trying to simplify those procedures. But I think the reforms will have to percolate downwards. Having got all this, if it takes you 2 years to get a clearance from a local municipality for building a factory. So in the area of real estate and construction, we rank 185 out of 189. We rank 185 out of 189. And that's something which has to improve right in the states and even below the state governments at the level of panchayats and the municipalities. And I think rather than be just concerned about what numerical position we get, we must look at the areas where we actually need to improve. And I would earmark this one area, real estate, land permissions, where India needs to improve over the next year or so, if we are to up our rankings in the ease of doing business.
I think the tax GST and just more tax transparency is massively important. So I think I'd say the second thing is in some way we need the right formula to make infrastructure investing more consistently bankable. You know, whether it's power or airports or roads. I think there's a lot of foreign capital or even domestic capital that will come in if it just becomes more repetitive and things like that. And then I think the last thing, Minister, and Anand, I think you would agree with this, is just we have to do a mass training effort of the human resources in India. I think we deal with it most acutely in the healthcare sector, but the ability to really drive the ability to train people on the ground, on the front lines more adequately, I think that remains, and that's really a public-private opportunity.
As a visitor who's come from a long distance, why don't you end this session with your last question to the Minister, if you have one?
So really, Minister, I would just, we've talked a little bit about it tonight, but you've been so active and taken so many bold decisions. All of us know that have done this frequently, you won't see the impact of these for 5 or 10 years in the future. So if you think about the way India will look 10 years from now, and you think about the decisions today, how do you see it?
I think if we go on the track and follow the roadmap which we are laying down, I think India should have a better infrastructure. India will have a larger manufacturing base. Most important, we would have reduced the level of poverty in India, more job creation. And as I said, the environment for doing business would be entirely different. I go back to what I said in my opening comments. We really have to change the way India lives and India spends, and therefore the new normal itself in India will shift. And that's the effort of this entire exercise.
Thank you.
So Anand, maybe it's really an honor to be here. And again, I want to maybe repeat one thing I said, which is we have a new American president. The spirit between the U.S.-India relationships is quite strong. And I think we'll give it time to see the policy roll out and things like that. But I remain quite confident and quite optimistic about the relationships of the two countries going forward. I would say that. And I would also say I've had the chance to know Anand. I have great respect for Anand and for the minister. But I think as an outsider, what we see at the top of India today, and again, everybody has their own politics, is a leader who's incredibly hardworking, incredibly transparent, and willing to make very tough decisions. And I think most global investors find that to be quite appealing. So I feel great about GE's future in the country, and I feel quite optimistic about the country itself. So it's a great discussion. Great to be with you tonight. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
A resounding applause, please, ladies and gentlemen, for that extremely insightful session that brought the best minds together. Mr. Jaitley, Jeff, Mr. Mahindra, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.